Hi, Sita and Laurie. Thank you for joining us here in PwC's webcast studios today. Brief intros, if we may. I'll just go really quickly. So Jane Allen, I'm a partner here in San Francisco with PwC, and I'm a member of our PwC Global Board. Sunita, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself.
Sure. Hi, Jane. Thanks for having us here. So I'm currently a board member at two public companies, Sunrun and TrueBlue, and also an advisor at the venture capital firm here in Silicon Valley.
And hi, I'm Laurie Yoler, and I am a general partner at Playground Global, as well as serving on one public board and quite a number of private company boards, as well as nonprofits.
Thank you both for taking your time today, and thank you both for your time with the Blue Ribbon Commission of the NACD report, which we're here to talk about today. So I'm excited to get some of your insights and some of the context of the report. So this year's report is entitled, and we've got the great copies here, Culture as the Foundation, Building a High Performance Board. When I first saw the title and we talked about having this conversation, the first thing that crosses my mind is board culture is a topic we hear about quite a bit, but I think sometimes we need to define what that is, and I think the title of the report talking about board performance is interesting. So maybe I could ask each of you a little bit about just defining what this is and why the Blue Ribbon Commission decided on this topic and what this means for boards as opposed to what folks think board culture typically means.
Great, I guess I can start. So let's talk about definition first. So for me personally, culture is really about a set of shared beliefs, values, norms and behaviors that a group of people subscribes to in order to achieve a common goal. And when you take a step back today, I think the world has changed, Jane, as you know, it's lots of challenges, are becoming more complex and all that. So I think in this world that is, I think the study calls it the perma-crisis situation. I think boards need to develop more agility and more resiliency in order to be more effective in this oversight responsibilities. And I think that really where culture comes in, because when you have a strong culture, it can ignite high performance and also contributes positively to long-term value. But if you have a weak culture, that it can be an impediment to progress and also can be value destructive. And so I think that is why I believe this new NACD Blue Ribbon Commission study, the timing is actually very perfect because culture, a lot of time, is really the foundation to become a high-performing board.
And I think the perma-crisis is interesting. We have climate change, we have social issues, we have geopolitical issues, we have a new workforce that has different expectations. So the perma-crisis was an interesting way to describe what's happening now. And we've spent a lot of time talking about employee culture and corporate culture in the last few years, but we haven't put the same level of scrutiny on board culture. And on my boards, I don't think there has been an explicit discussion of what is our culture and is it really optimal for now? It may have been optimal in the past when the board was first structured or when the company was created, but is it serving us now? And is it meeting the needs of management and shareholders? And are we really an optimal board in terms of our performance, how we function, what are our behavioral norms, and what are the implicit and explicit rules and norms of the board? And have we ever discussed them as a team?
What's interesting is the discussion of perma-crisis, for instance, and there is a lot of pretty urgent, I would say unique topics that are sort of all intersecting at the same time. But when folks generally hear the term culture in general, it sounds amorphous or it sounds soft. I think sometimes, frankly, people dismiss it. Those are two ends of the spectrum here with a topic that we've unified together as part of this report. And maybe talk about that a little bit, about this sort of just idea of culture, but why we've really linked it here to performance. I know you talked a little bit about whether it could be an accelerant or an impediment, but maybe let's break that down a little bit.
Sure, yeah, I would say you are right. I think in many boards, culture is implicitly assumed, but not necessarily explicitly discussed. But I do see opportunities, I think, for some of the more forward-thinking boards to actually be much more intentional in defining what is the optimal culture that it wants to have, and also in reinforcing some of the behavioral norms that are necessary in order to have this optimal culture. So let me just use a quick example. Actually, on one of my boards, we recently just had a CEO change, and not too long ago, we had a board leadership change. And at the same time, the company still has to go through like a pretty big business transformation journey. And so the board actually look at this opportunity as an inflection point, as an opportunity for the board to come together to be much more explicit in terms of what is the optimal culture that we want to have, to ensure that our culture is actually fit for purpose in order to be able to provide effective oversight as this company goes through the journey. And actually I found by being explicit, it is very positive for the board because then we were very engaged in open and honest discussions and conversations, also in our interactions with management. And I think it resulted in kind of like a culture where management feels comfortable not just to share all the good things that they're doing, but also some of the real material challenges that the companies are facing.
You know, this the NACD Blue Ribbon Commission report, the first section is about board agility. So a static board is probably not serving the company anymore. And you can't just say, hey, let's talk about culture. Won't that be fun, right? You know, we have all these other things that are happening in the world. We don't have time to talk about soft issues. But if you highlight, first of all, if you have a rigorous board performance review process that involves management, I think it's very interesting that in most boards that I've seen, and the report highlights it, management is expecting the board to be up to speed on a whole plethora of issues that they didn't used to be. It's not just about, have you read the financials and have you read the compensation and you know what's going on in those issues. There are now so many other issues that companies are addressing, and hence boards need to be a step ahead, or at least viewing what's happening outside of the company to be able to weigh in on all these issues. And it was interesting on one of my boards, there was a feeling that boards are mostly an oversight role and shouldn't be getting their hands terribly dirty. And what came back in the performance review is, hey, we're looking for challenge, we're looking for outside views. We want to have a really healthy debate about the strategic choices that we're making, which is a shift. And the report describes an agile board as one that's very curious and continuing to learn. And I think that is a somewhat novel approach for many boards today.
Well, Laurie, you bring up, I think some of the terminology used in the past is nose in, fingers out.
Yes.
Is that still applicable, or are we seeing a sea shift in terms of the mentality, what you just described as an example?
You know, we had a lengthy discussion about that on the Blue Ribbon Commission, which was really interesting. Given all of the new topics that boards are being asked to weigh in on and think about, we can't just stay in our lanes as perhaps might have been done in the past. And so they suggested it's eyes open and fingers on the pulse. And fingers on the pulse of many, many issues, not just diving in. There's still, it's still very important that boards don't dive in and run the company and dive in on operational issues and start demanding lengthy reports on a variety of issues that they might have personal interest in. So there is still, it needs to be a separation between management's role and the board's role. But given management's expectations that boards are up to date if they're going to be viewed as really helping shape the future of the company and hopefully the company's strategy going forward, they've got to be up to speed on a lot of issues. And therefore, I think fingers on the pulse is very important. And of course, they need to know what's going on inside of the company in case an issue arises.
You know, between a lot of the mega forces you were talking about and some of the changes, I know boards in recent years have taken steps to make sure that the expertise that the different board members bring to the table is perhaps more diverse than before, right? So there's diversity in general of thought and gender and racial aspects that have been talked about, but diversity of experience, right? So for a long time I felt the trend was we need a cyber expert, we need a cyber expert. Then we had privacy, and then now there's a lot of talk around AI, and there's so many different dynamics. But I think in some of this aspect, we talked about board members being heard, and you're actually getting the value. Maybe you could speak a little bit about ensuring that the diversity of the people that the boards have taken time to bring to the table, that the value and their voices are being heard. How does that play into all of this culturally?
Yeah, great question. And you mentioned cybersecurity. Actually, let me use that as just one example, real life example, because it's a hot topic in many public boards these days. So I would say let's just say generally in the more traditional boards, I think cyber is actually being viewed in a silo as a risk only. And also perhaps a lot of the longer tenured board members may not be as familiar with cyber as a part of like a larger innovation and technology and how it links to business risk and opportunities. But again, I would say I see opportunities for the forward-thinking boards to actually be willing to take a step back and look at whether the current composition and structure of the board is still fit for purpose for where the company is, and also whether the allocation of risk still appropriate or makes sense. And so as an example, actually one of my boards, innovation technology is such an integral part of our company's business strategy. So about a few years ago, we decided we needed a standing committee on the board that focuses on innovation and technology. And we onboarded new board members that have a technology perspective, but also understand the larger impact of technology, cyber, business risk, and opportunities. But even though we have this dedicated standing committee focusing on innovation technology, they don't work in a vacuum, and they collaborate very closely with the audit committee because the overall enterprise risk management fits with the audit committee. So Jane, actually I'm sharing this with you because it's an example of how there is the old ways of doing business for boards. Of course, it has to be appropriate for where your board is in its journey. But I think the forward thinking and board that has a healthy culture is willing to look at new ways to ensure that the board structure and composition still fit for purpose, and also the allocation of risk are being appropriately allocated within the different board committees.
I think the board matrix is such a great place to start, and a really healthy discussion and debate on what are the most important things that the company is facing, and therefore what is the expertise we need on the board now. And it may be different from what we needed 2 years ago. Where are we going? Technology is a great example. Supply chain was another one. Cybersecurity, now the discussion on AI. So how do we bring that expertise into the boardroom? Some boards are using outside experts that weigh in frequently. Some are using technology advisory boards. Others are bringing in new board members who have that expertise but can also check more of the boxes. I think where sometimes new board members run into trouble is if they feel they really need to stay in their lane and they're an expert in one area but stay quiet during discussions of anything else. And as we know, boards need to have the opportunity and courage to learn about new areas, as well as to be a leader across all those different discussions, certainly not dominating the discussion, but being able to weigh in and staying informed. The agile board, as the report talks about, because so many things are changing every year that no one is going to be able to keep up on everything. There is so much to think about, especially if you look at all of the new geopolitical and societal issues. And so it behooves a board member to have an understanding of all of them and then have places where they can go deeper. But I think bringing in an expert and that expert believing that they only need to stay abreast of one issue is where trouble can occur.
Right. And I would say in general, boards are wary about bringing too narrowly focused directors, because at the end of the day, sure, we want someone who's an expert in specific areas, but in general, we love to have board members who are well-rounded business leaders who also understand the larger strategy, finance, M&A, capital allocation, and other aspects that are important in order to be able to provide effective oversight.
To that end, when we were both chatting before, you both have experience on public and private boards. Do you have any observations, or as part of the commission report, thoughts in terms of the differences between public versus private, or your own thoughts in terms of how this applies maybe slightly differently?
Perhaps I'll let Laurie go first. She's more experienced in private,
In the US, they're both subject to Delaware law, so the legal framework is the same, and the SEC is taking a look at both of them in many areas. And it depends on the size of the company, But there are some significant differences in terms of the reporting requirements and other metrics that are used. But I think savvy private boards look at what public companies are doing and pull the best practices and benchmarks from those public companies and try to operate in a similar fashion using wonderful benchmarks like what the NACD provides. Small early stage private boards are probably not going to be following those kinds of benchmarks until they're getting ready to go public. But I think larger private boards, and there are many of them, hopefully are looking at these and pulling out best practices.
Mm-hmm.
And I presume on just simply the fact of a public board, you've got just a whole other set of stakeholders taking a look at what the board is doing and such, and obviously shareholder activism and such that folks are keenly aware of these days, right?
Yes.
In the mix of everything
Yes.
else, in the perma-crisis mix, right?
Right.
Yes, but you still have employees and
Right.
shareholders and customers in a
Exactly.
private board,
Yes.
so they're still watching what you're doing.
Quite a bit. The report was incredible in terms of talking through a number of layers of this. And one of the things I wanted to hit upon, and maybe this is a good place in terms of thinking about making sure you're getting the full value of all the different members of the board, is there are a number of toolkits that were included in the report. I thought that was fabulous in terms of giving just really tactical, how do you now move to execution and act upon these and connecting the dots. Maybe some commentary there as a commission, how you thought about the toolkits, how and why they were included, and just the thoughtfulness that was put together behind them.
Yeah, I would say the toolkits are very helpful. Once a board has the realization that they need to change or they want to talk about culture more explicitly, I think what the toolkit does really give you very practical steps in order to take intent into action. And when you look at the toolkits, they're really organized around three big areas. The first one is on what are the steps boards can do in order to define the optimal culture that the board wants to have. And then the second big bucket is what are the processes and structures that the board needs to put in place in order to reinforce the optimal culture and also the behavioral norms that are necessary. And I think the toolkit also comes with practical recommendations on how boards can address and have the courage to address some of the more major cultural fault lines that can be an impediment towards having a healthy board culture.
Yeah, one of the checklists was red flags on that your
Yes.
board culture may not be healthy, and there were many, many good ones.
Self-awareness check.
Right,
Yes,
right.
and I think the red flags list things like the board is too conciliatory and never pushes back, or there's a very disruptive
Right.
director that no one is calling out
Right.
because of wanting this conciliatory behavior, the lack of trust that can be evidenced by the voting process being difficult, crowded board agendas, management not feeling good about their board of directors, lots of red flags. But there were others that were wonderful steps in terms of what should be included in an optimal performance evaluation for the board and for individual board members. How do you have those discussions? What is effective leadership, and what should board leadership be doing differently now to make sure that everyone feels included? So there were fabulous checklists in there.
To that end, those toolkits and the checklists are great tools, right? Resources, I'm going to use that term, tactical resources. But how does a board start the conversation, right? Especially if you read some of these red flags and you might say, I see some of these happening
Right.
on our board, and knowing there could be strong dynamics, tenured, less tenured, strong voices that control, et cetera, various things, right, and included in that list. How would one begin the discussion and the dialogue, even with your fellow board members?
Yeah, I would say depending on your comfort level, there are several ways you can address this. I think first you can bring it up during the board's self-evaluation, but this is usually an annual exercise, so the time might not be appropriate for every situation. Second, I think if you feel comfortable, you can bring it up during executive sessions after each board meeting. Explain, why you see some areas that you're concerned about, and you have some suggestions on how to improve it. If none of these work for your particular situation, if you feel comfortable, I think you should reach out to either the chair of the board or the lead independent director, because they actually are the primary culture carrier for the board. and have an open and honest discussions with them and ask for their help in order to address some of the situations or help to navigate through these difficult conversations. I've even known some directors who feel comfortable to actually reach out to the director in question directly, but I would say this is rare. I think most directors probably do not feel comfortable to do this, and they go through the leader of the board. But I also say it is, from what I've seen, it is generally good practice for board members to try to get to know each other as individuals, because then you feel more comfortable. When you know someone, you better understand where they're coming from. So I would highly encourage board members to reach out, have coffees, dinners, lunches outside of the board, formal board meetings, so that you get to know them as individuals, and it will lead to like a better and more open and honest dynamics in the boardroom.
I think all of those were brought up as suggestions, and they're great suggestions, and certainly the chair and lead director are so important in having those discussions, because if it's one problematic director, you may not be able to have that in executive session, and you're right, you probably don't want to wait a year if there's a real problem. I also find the general counsel is often helpful in just being a sounding board. You know, they can't weigh in and vote, but they can be a sounding board for ideas. And then one of the things that I find incredibly valuable is if I notice something in a board meeting, I often make the assumption, wow, they must not be educated on that topic. And so I will send around NACD reports or other reports to the whole board and say, hey, I just read this report and I found this incredibly valuable. I hope you do too. Please call me and maybe we should have a conversation about this at our next board meeting. Great suggestion.
So one of the, you touched upon this a moment ago, Laurie, is in terms of management's perception of the board. And I think the report has a study that cites that less than a third of management, now take a study for whatever grain of salt you'd like, but less than a third of management is feeling really great about the board's performance. I mean, that was pretty surprising to me. And granted, there's so much going on, but it was 29%, I believe.
Yes.
Do either of you have any sort of thoughts on what's behind that, or perhaps, the direct linkage is here in terms of what's missing there?
It brings up a whole new area of board and management relationship. Who is managing the expectations? If a executive on the leadership team comes in and presents to the board, have they been coached and educated on what to expect? Have they provided the right materials up front? Have they opened it by saying, this is just educational materials, or have they said, I really want a vigorous debate as part of this discussion, or we're going to be taking a vote, so it's critical that you all answer questions. And so when those huge board packs are sent out, do they feature the right materials so that the board gets fully educated on the topic? And then has the board had a discussion on, hey, when a new executive comes in the room, let's not be terribly aggressive in asking questions. And I find that in many of my boards, what's come out of the performance evaluation is sometimes the executives say, I feel, you guys challenged me too much. But in other boards, it's, I really expected to be a lot more challenged. So it's communicating expectations. And I think the leadership team also needs to be educated on, you need to let the board know what you want to get out of this. Are you asking questions up front? And I've seen in some board packs now, executives will put at the beginning, here are my expectations, and here are the 2 questions I'd like you to all come to the board with insight on. And that gives the board time to think and perhaps do research and come with really tangible input. And I find more and more management is expecting more tangible input from the board. They feel that they've spent all this time to produce these materials and they want lots of feedback, but perhaps the board isn't educated on that topic, or perhaps they haven't communicated clearly what they want, and so there's this mismatch.
Yeah, actually I would love to add on that. I think in order to be an effective board member, you need to have a good understanding about the business that you're overseeing. And when you look at it, board meetings, we meet like 4 or 5 times a year if there's no crisis. So I don't think board should only depend on what is being presented during the board meetings or the materials prepared for the board meetings to really understand kind of the deep unique challenges and opportunities of the company, of the industry, the customers, the employees, the regulatory environments, and many other factors. So without overstepping your boundaries, I always encourage board members, of course with management involvement, to take advantages of opportunities to meet customers, meet employees, in certain cases meet shareholders. And also, I personally like to use the products and services that the companies offer. I also use the competitors' products and services so that I understand what is the difference. And I love to also listen to the earnings calls, not just of our companies, but also our competitors.
Yes, excellent
because
idea.
it gives you insights as to what's truly going on in the industry. So I think first and foremost, it's an interaction between management and the board, but the board needs to take the time and energy to really understand the business that they're actually
the industry
overseeing.
context.
Yes.
So that you can come and say,
Exactly.
wow, I saw that your competitor did this. Did you consider that?
Right.
And if you're not keeping really abreast of all of the things, not just in governance, but also with the industry context, you're not able to have that
deep
really interesting, deep conversation,
Yes.
both in the boardroom and outside. And I think many boards also will match members of the management team with the board, so that you get really to know each of the functions and each of the executives, and you rotate them each year. So you're not just showing up to the board meeting and nothing in between.
So a couple things on that. One, it sounds a little bit of just in general, board directors have slightly different perhaps or evolving expectations of them, just the way the pace and all the, I'll go back to the perma-crisis citation. But two, the director onboarding process is also something perhaps key to that and those expectations. Maybe if you could both comment on some of that and how that fits into kind of how board culture should be thinking about where they want to be as well.
Well, yeah, I think when a new director joins a new board, when you think about it, the company is on a journey, and like a bus, you're on a bus, the bus is on a journey, new board comes onto the bus. And so when a new board comes onto the bus, usually the new board members do not yet have the context, institutional knowledge, and also they don't understand the cultural dynamics of the boardroom and the management. And I've seen new directors react to this differently. Some directors may be reluctant to express his or her opinion because they're afraid that their opinions may not be on the mark. Other directors feel the need to actually share their opinions, even if their opinions may or may not be on the marks.
Right.
And still others, usually feel pressure to go with the dominant opinion because they don't yet feel comfortable with their own understanding of the situation. And so I think it is very helpful for the leader of the board, namely the chair of the lead independent director. This is really where they come in to help the new director voice his or her opinion, perhaps ask them to share their opinion first during the discussions, solicit opinions from some of the quieter members of the boards. And I've also found it very helpful when the chair of the board check in with you. When you're a new board member, after each board meeting, they call you to just check in with you, get feedback, give you feedback. It's very helpful. And this concept of board buddy, so what you were talking about, management and board, but longer tenured board member can also be paired with a newer tenured board member, so that the longer tenured board member can then share all of these more kind of nuanced context, institutional knowledge, and dynamics of the boardroom. I think in a lot of times when you onboard a new board members, especially if you give it to the general counsel, usually it doesn't include kind of like some of these softer, more nuanced context of where the company is on the journey or where the board is on the journey. A lot of the materials are, factual. Of course, you need to know that. But I think in order for a new board member to be successful, you also need to understand context and institutional knowledge.
And behavioral norms.
Yes.
One of my, after being on the Blue Ribbon Commission, I was joining a new board, and I called the other board members and said, okay, you've told me what the explicit norms and expectations are. Now tell me what the implicit ones are. And some of the implicit ones are, okay, after the board meeting and after the board dinner, some folks go to a bar afterwards where the real discussions happen.
I was given similar advice in my situation, which was important.
Do you go to the bar afterwards, and is there anything off limits, or is this where everyone unpacks what actually happened at the board meeting? And those are the things that you're not going to find in the written materials. And so I was given wonderful advice from an NACD forum that as a new board member, I should call the chair after each of my first 4 meetings and just debrief and get feedback on my behavior as well as give him or her feedback. And it proved to be a really great suggestion because you have no idea whether you fit and you want to nip anything in the bud that wasn't appropriate. And it may be your board buddy or it may be the chair or the lead director, but immediate follow-up as a new director, I think, and I guess to add on to what you said, in some boards it is expected that new directors immediately contribute. In other boards, the culture is you need to sit back and really soak in institutional knowledge, which you only get through board meetings, and then you can participate later. But they don't tell you that, and it's not written down. It's part of the implicit culture.
You know, as you describe that, and in some ways it's more quickly making sure that you are well integrated and adding value in the way that you and the board and management expect. And I think about the landscape of traditional boards before, meeting every quarter, whatnot, and that's not a whole lot of time to build some of what you talked about, building trust with each other, and then you layer on, the perma-crises and how fast and different things are just developing. If I think about the last month, for instance, so much has happened just in that time span, right? So with that sort of, I'm going to say, agility aspect and speed that we talked about as part of, a high-performing board, in the middle of that, how are boards transitioning to be able to operate that way, and how are they making decisions, right? If a board is cognizant of trying to make some cultural changes, yet faced with all of this at the same time, how are they making decisions these days, and how is that cultural component fitting in to making agile, quick, appropriate decisions?
That is a great question. I'll actually answer it first from a cultural perspective. I think it is absolutely best practice for board decisions to actually be made inside the boardroom after all members of the boards have had the opportunity to engage in a healthy debate and discussions, and where material information can be accessed by all board members. I think that is best practice. I think it is absolutely poor practice when board decisions are being made outside of the boardroom, especially when only a small group of board members are involved, and when material information are only accessed by this smaller group of people. But to answer your question with regards to agility, I think these days, all board members understand that they have to just be more available. They are more available. They are meeting more often. You don't have to wait until the quarterly board meetings. Sometimes we do have monthly check-in depending on what the situation is and how relevant the particular challenge is for your company. So I think in order to be agile, first the board has to have this good culture that is inclusive. It's not like a smaller group of people have certain information that others don't and they make decisions, but also the commitment from all board members to actually be more available and also be more knowledgeable on all these different challenges that are going on in the world and for the company, and also be committed to being more inclusive throughout all of these journey that we are all facing in this new perma-crisis environment.
Given the number of issues, though, that come up, committees have become more and more important, and a lot of the serious work is done in committee, and the decisions may be made by the whole board, but the data gathering, the analysis, the detailed substantive work is often done in committee.
That's true.
So do you have the right folks in the committee so you can trust their output? What are you putting on which committee? And are the committees covering everything that's important? Because often committees meet much more frequently, especially if the company's going through a transaction or some kind of divestiture or reorganization or making some big strategic change. There may be a committee, a special committee, or an existing committee that's assigned that's meeting much more frequently, and then it's behooves them to educate the rest of the board, and that trust has to be there that we've put the right people on the committee who the rest of the board can trust and then feel that they can make a vote based on the committee's recommendation.
Yep.
With all the work that went into the report and looking at all the Blue Ribbon Commission members, it looked like a fairly diverse and really experienced group adding to this, which is fabulous. Was there anything in the report, as you read through it, kind of the final version with all the information aggregate together, that surprised you, if I may ask?
I would say not in the report, but in the process. We were all on Zoom calls, and I felt that the things that I was dealing with in my boards were unique, and to hear basically everyone was having the same issues across the board, and we were all finishing each other's sentences. And it's interesting because you often think, wow, I'm feeling really strange about how this is going in my board, but maybe it's me. And then to hear all of these directors from all over geographically and different levels of tenure and board governance experience all having very similar issues. And then the thing that really resonated with me, and I've taken away as my number one takeaway, was the implicit versus explicit rules, because most of my boards have a lengthy document of the explicit rules. We expect you to come to all board meetings. We expect you to read the materials. We expect no side conversations. Sure, but then what are those implicit rules?
Right. I think for me, also the more of the process that was surprising. What was surprising was I think almost all commissioners agree that culture is important, but then most of the boards that the commissioners are on actually do not talk about culture explicitly.
Right.
Everything was implicit.
Right.
And so that was kind of surprising that everyone agrees it's important, but almost everyone's boards do not kind of like have a conscious effort to talk about it explicitly. I would say the key takeaways for me would be the importance of actually being explicit and intentional. If you want to have a certain culture, you have to put in the effort. You have to talk about it. You have to define what is the culture you want. You have to reinforce it. And you have to have the courage to actually address the red flags when you see it.
But too much alignment, right?
Sure.
You don't want everybody snapping into culture fit, because that is the enemy of diversity, right? And you don't want affiliation bias where everyone looks, feels, and smells the same. So we want diversity,
For sure.
but we want a shared mission,
Right.
and a shared behavioral norms, shared agreement on decision making, on communication styles, on how we interact with management, on how often we rotate committee chairs, all of that. We don't need to all behave exactly the same way. And we want to embrace diversity of opinion and diversity of backgrounds, but we need to be aligned on how we accomplish things.
Totally. I think to sum it up, Laurie, when you look at board decision making at the extremes, right, you can have a groupthink, cohesion and harmony, very important. I don't think that's good. But on the other extreme, you can also have disruptive disagreements that led to irreconcilable differences. You don't want that either. So I think you want a culture that's healthy enough where most boards, I think, aim for the middle, the optimal middle, where there is healthy debates and discussions happening in the boardroom that lead to a constructive consensus. So it's not consensus at all costs, it's a constructive consensus where board members understand that, at some point they do have to agree to go in a certain direction after healthy debates and discussions. However, a full consensus may or may not be achieved at all time.
Right.
Yeah.
I think one of the big themes or takeaways for me reading the report, and again, I was just so impressed with the overarching sort of framing of the topic and why this is important, combined with the very tactical toolkit behind. But I think, again, just that culture is just viewed as this amorphous, soft, let's go do a fun activity together type of exercise. But really, my takeaway is the report really frames it up as a framework for board performance. That is really the overarching framework to be a high-performing board, and that changes the entire narrative and the imperative, in my mind, to focus on this topic.
Right. It's about performance, and it's about agility, and it's about management and the board working together for a shared goal.
So in closing, any last thoughts, just as folks out there might be receiving the report and looking to digest it, of what you think you hope folks will get out of it. I know we talked about the takeaways, but what you hope the readers and other NACD audience and what you hope this might do to boards across the country.
I guess for me, as you download the report, if you're a member of NACD, just kind of like remember that this is really made in order to help you leverage your culture to be a strength, so that you can be a high-performing board, especially in this new world where things are changing very fast and things are very complex. And you don't have to finish all in one go. You can refer to it, as you're faced with certain challenges or certain situations, and look at some of the examples or some of the tools that might be able to help you to better navigate through some of these challenges that you might face as a board member.
The one big takeaway is, have we discussed board culture? I mean, it's as simple as that. Are we going to put that on an agenda to define what our culture is, define whether it's optimal, and if not, how we're going to get there? I think, big tangible takeaway is, let's put that on a board agenda, probably an executive session, and let's see if we need to work on it.
Great. Well, thank you both again for spending your time here, and thank you so much for the time and effort and input into this report. I found it so valuable. I've already sent it to a number of colleagues and other contacts that I have, and I hope folks will use this as a great resource, so thank you again.
I think it's a fabulous output, and it was really a terrific process, and really an honor to be included in it.
And one of the few actual physical paper
Yes,
things that I'm
we
going to
have
keep
it.
around for
Yeah.
reference these days. So
Thank you so
thank you
much.
both. Thank you.
you.
Thank you.